University in the United Kingdom, and he earned his PhD in linguistics and English language from Newcastle University, also in the United Kingdom. His research interests include second language acquisition, TESOL, teacher identities and experiences, and language variations. He's a section editor for Open Linguistics, DGRITA, an editorial board member of the English Language Teaching Journal from Oxford. He's also a regular reviewer for various journals, including Second Language Research, System, Language and Speech, and the Journal of Psycholinguistic Research. He's a serving executive member of the British Association for Applied Linguistics, and he's published journal articles in international refereed outlets and book chapters by key publishers in the field. And just of the many articles and book chapters he's published, I would like to mention one of them that is of interest for our talk today, which is Deteriorating Standard, a brief look into the English standard in Hong Kong, that was published in Asian Englishes. Finally, I'd like to add that Dr. Leung has just been granted some funds for a project about the experiences of international and ethnic minoritized students in higher education in the United Kingdom. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Leung.
Thank you so much, Florencia, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. I hope that, and thank you for coming in this Friday afternoon. I know that is a busy time of the year for everybody, so hopefully this talk would be interesting enough to keep your attention for about 40 minutes or so. Right, so can you guys actually see my screen? Yeah, okay, great. Let me just go to the presentation mode and then we can get started. Right, so today I'll be talking about, I will be trying to make a case for introducing variations inside the language classrooms, right? So why is that important? We'll try to outline in this particular presentation. So before I begin, right, so I want to show you a rough outline of what I'm going to be talking about today, so that you have an idea about where we're at and how did I actually come to be interested in such a topic. I wanted to sort of begin by giving you some contextual information about the so-called standard, the notion of standard, and why it is actually problematic. And as many of you are language teachers, you might have already realized that a lot of the materials that we actually use in our classrooms tend to actually lean very heavily towards the so-called standard, right? But what I'm going to show you in the next couple of minutes would be to let you know that, hey, actually the so-called standard can actually at times be very arbitrary. And from there onwards, I want to sort of outline some of the social ramifications, right, and implications of these variations, and pointing out why they can be very problematic in the sense that it can often lead to discriminations and stereotypes. And that's the reason why it is important to try and enhance people's exposure, students' exposure towards variations. And I'll also try and make a case based on linguistic evidence as well. So the social aspects is obviously very important, but the linguistics is also very important as well. So I'll be trying to sort of make a linguistic case as well, and explain why potentially introducing variations can be beneficial for language acquisition and also language learning as well. Ultimately, what I wanted to achieve through this particular talk is to try and get everybody thinking a little bit more about this notion of standards and be more critical of such a notion, so that we can create an environment where we are actually serving our learners' real communication needs, and also creating an environment that is more accommodating and more accepting towards diversity and differences. So that's what I'm going to be hopefully be doing today. But before I formally begin, I also wanted to say I'll be referring mostly to examples about second language or foreign language English, mainly because this is an area that I'm familiar with, but I'll also on occasion make references to other languages as well. But I would hope that a lot of the things that I'm talking about today would be relevant for other languages other than English as well. Okay, so right. So to begin with, I wanted to sort of provide a definition, which is not something that hopefully this is something that is quite familiar to you all already. When we think about varieties in a language and also the so-called standard, often they're set up, right, or they defined in opposition to one another, right? So when we look at a definition for dialects and varieties, for example, in this particular reference that I put down there, is set against the so-called notion, the so-called standard, right? So what do we mean by dialect? A dialect is something that is different from the so-called standard, right? But then when you look at the definition of the standard, it sort of work kind of the opposite, right? So they would define the standard as something that is not the dialect, right? So this in some ways is quite circular, and hopefully in a couple of slides time, I'll be able to demonstrate that this whole notion, this whole construct and monolithic thinking of the so-called standard is actually highly problematic, right? So, and we know that dialects can vary in terms of different aspects of the language. So it can be to do with morphological differences, syntactic differences, and pronunciation perhaps is something that is quite familiar to people, but it can also be related to or relevant to word choices issues as well, right? And we know, and I will also explain this a little bit further with some examples of English variations in the native speaking context in just a second, but a lot of times variations can actually be originated based on geographical factors, but also socio-economic background as well, right? So, and also we know increasingly people are looking into the role of ethnicity and race and so on, and how they intersect with one another. And these basic kind of building blocks would lead to various kind of variations and differences on a local and also transnational level as well, which I'll explain in just a second. Right, so, but it is also worth thinking about, right? So when we talked about this notion of standard, the notion of dialect or dialectal varieties, it is important for us to remember that languages is a very fluid concept, right? And very often they evolve through time, right? So on this particular slide, I've listed an example based on based on English data, right? So looking from a historical perspective, English, like any other languages, English is no exception. It has changed through time, right? So we know that in the older English time, their usages and also grammatical structures look quite different from the present day English that we use today, right? The example that I've got in here has to do with inflectional morphology, right? So as you can see that in Old English, which is listed on the left-hand side column, you can see that our different inflectional morphologies being applied to depending on the person kind of agreement, right? So in the first person's settings, right, you have a different inflectional morpheme to mark that particular agreement, which is no longer the case in present day English, right? So the examples that you can see on the right, the only thing that is being marked is the third person singular third person singular feature in there, right? So with the S marking in there, but that was not the case, right? In older English, we actually have a richer morphology, just like Spanish does. You have a lot of inflection morphology being marked in there. And also the syntactic structures or also word order, well, syntactic structures might not be the best way to put it, but in terms of surface word order anyway, you have a slight difference, right? And in fact, it's recent as Shakespearean's time, right? So a sentence like, I speak not French, is still allowed, right? And still kind of okay, right? Even though you don't hear that often, such a construction that often anymore in present day English, right? Which the common form would be to use the do support, right? So I don't speak French would be a more common way of expressing that same notion, right? But you can still say I speak not French, right? Just that you sound super archaic, right? So people will be like, oh, are you sort of throwing this Shakespeare textbook at me now, right? So, and this is something that can happen, right? Because language is not a stable construct, right? And it is often affected by a lot of different social changes, right? Such as the notion of leveling, right? So some dialects can converge and become very similar to one another. Sometimes you have dissociation where the dialects are becoming more distinct from one another. right? So after we've established, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself, right? So this is something that the so-called big powerhouses of the language is now increasingly recognizing as well, right? So very recently, I attended an OED, so Oxford English Dictionary World English Symposium, where they talked a lot about how the language has actually changed, right? And they are increasingly trying to engage with that by including some of those entries from World Englishes, so that it's formalized, it's codified, right? So when you look at the so-called standard, right, very often people will tell you, hey, this is the thing that is codified, that's something that you can find in dictionary. And now actually a lot of World Englishes usages are being codified as we speak as well. So this is telling us that, hey, language is always changing and it's being more widely recognized as such these days, even by the formal institutions such as the Oxford English Dictionary. An example I gave in there has to do with an entry from Hong Kong English, which is quite interesting, because as the article that Florencia mentioned earlier, and which was published in 2015, I also referred to this example, but at that point, this was not a formalized entry just yet. But in 2018, right, so a few years after I talked about it in that paper, it has become one of these entries that is listed in the OED as well. Right, so as I said before, so dialectal variations can interact with a lot of different aspects. So social factors such as class and identity might play a role, and the styles, right? So whether it's a formal setting or whether it is an informal setting between friends, and how much attention people are paying to their speech can all affect the variance that people supply, right? This is no surprise to many people, and also when you look at the example on this slide, this is taken from a native speaking context, right? So when we're talking about dialectal variations in the context of a language classrooms, very often people would immediately jump to, oh, the non-native standard, right? But what I'm trying to highlight in here is that, hey, actually, even within the native speaking context, you have a lot of variations in there, right? So this example has to do with whether people pronounce their H's or not. In UK English, a lot of the H's are sometimes dropped, but in some certain settings, that is actually more pronounced, right? And we can see from this particular diagram, for example, that it actually interacts with class as well, right? So, so if you are in Bradford, which is in the west part of Yorkshire in England, if you are lower working class, right, the likelihood of you pronouncing the H is actually really low, right? So 93% of the time people are not producing these H's, right? So this is arguably quite a dated study, but this is hopefully an illustrative example of how class, right, so social factors such as class can interact with dialectal variations as well, right? So and there is also another good example, right? Because when people talked about L2 English or second language learning in the context of English, people are often lamented by the fact that, hey, learners often struggle to produce a third person singular S, right? Just to point out, actually, this is not, this is a feature that exists in some native varieties as well, right? So again, if you are a working class person from this time from a different part of the country, from Norwich, the likelihood of you supplying the third person singular marking is very low. But of course, the middle class people, or as soon as you go up the class scales, class is actually quite a salient feature in the context of the UK. It might not, I also appreciate that it might not be the same in some other contexts, but this is just to illustrate how social factors cannot be ignored when we're talking about dialectal variations and the so-called standard. So why am I talking about all these issues to do with dialects and variations then, right? So what I wanted to do is to try and provide a backdrop for us to try and problematize the notion of the standard, right? So, and this example that I have on the slide, right, which is something that is quite common, right? If you teach second language English, or if you teach a class about writing in English, very often in some of those prescriptive textbooks, they'll tell you this, right? So don't end a sentence with a preposition. So where does that actually come from, right? So, and I'm going to show you that the origin of this is actually very arbitrary, right? So somewhere along the lines, right? So in about 1700 in the UK, somebody in power, which is a bishop, who is actually a bishop, said something like this, right? So this is a quote from one of the references that I've included in my 2015 paper. You can see that, hey, actually, the bishop actually proclaimed, right? So, hey, ending a sentence with the preposition is actually quite common, right? So this is something, this is an idiom, this is something that our language is strongly inclined to. This already ending with a preposition in there, right? But somehow it makes better sense, right? It looks more elegant, right? In writing and more graceful, right? If we don't end the sentence with a preposition, right? So when you think about it logically and from a linguistic perspective, the sentence which says, he was the one to whom I talked, there's no difference with the second sentence, which is equally grammatical. We can understand it, right? He was the one who I talked to. It's equally valid as a sentence, but somehow somebody said so prescribed such a thing, like don't end your sentence with a preposition. It somehow got stuck, right? And then it became kind of the entrenched version, the prescriptive version of how you should use the language, right? So, and this is perhaps a more of a stylistic difference, right? Because of how people have been writing, right? So this is kind of this examples, right, tells us, hey, the notion of the so-called standard can sometimes be quite arbitrary, right? So somebody somewhere in the 17th, 18th century pronounced that, hey, this is a more elegant way, more graceful way to do things, and then it somehow got stuck, right? And when you open most of the textbooks that are targeting lay people perspective, right? So for a wider general audience, or readership, they would tell you this, right? So this is one of the rules in those writing books, in those textbooks or course books about writing. And there's another example, right, that I would sort of try and provide for you in just a second, right? So you might say, hey, hang on a second, right, Alex? I don't care where that arbitrary rule came from, right? It is historical. We've been following it through, right? So why don't we stick with history, right? So this historical perspective of the standard also doesn't really hold up, right? So when you think about what constitutes the standard, right? So the example that I'm going to give you, this is an example that I always refer to because I'm based in the north of England. This is an example coming from Northern Englishes, which has to do with the you, right? So in present day's usage, the pronoun you can refer to a single person, to a plural collective, right? So you could refer to everybody in this room, or you could refer to Florencia or Andrea, right? So one single person or a collective group of people, right? So this is quite common in the present day's usage, right? But actually, in some varieties of English, including the Northern variety where we're based, you and use are different, right? So you have a singular you, and then you also have use, which are distinct, right? So, and from maybe around Liverpool region up north, right? So going from Midlands or north-ish area of the UK, you can hear more and more of these, right? So this distinction between the singular and plural you actually used to exist, right? So people would tell you, hey, this is a non-standard feature, right? So you shouldn't use it. If you want to go and resort to the historical account, right? So you can see that, hey, actually this is super arbitrary, right? Because this was actually a distinction that older Englishes actually made, right? So how can we so reconcile that then, right? So it's not the case that, hey, you just follow history, then you'll be fine, right? So if you follow history, then you should all make the distinction between you and use, right? But nonetheless, this is not what is happening, right? Because in present day English, this is frowned upon, right? So this is definitely not wrong, right? But people would look at you with a weird face, right? They're like, oh, hey, how come you sound so northern, right? You're not from the northern part of the UK, right? So this is telling us, right? So these examples are telling us that, hey, actually, there's a whole notion of the so-called standard doesn't really hold up, right? So, and if we want, right, if we want to sort of go to that historical account, right, or historical argument, hey, Northern English speakers are actually more faithful to the older English, right? So we are right, right? So people up north are right, right? So there is this inferiority complex that many of our students in the north, right, often struggle with because they feel like, oh, we're not the southern people, we don't speak so posh, right? So our English is different. But I can tell them this, right? So, hey, actually, you should take pride in the fact that your English is more faithful playful, closer to the older type of English, right? So these two sort of very quick examples, right, allowed us to see, hey, why is it important for us to try and problematize and be more critical of the so-called standard. Okay, and why is this important then, right? Because we are in a context where there's a great deal of mobility, right, in terms of geographical locations, right? A lot of people are communicating with one another, right? So they might not be based, right? So we are actually in very far apart, right, at the moment. So I'm based in the UK speaking to you, and you are in Argentina, the majority of you, right? So these kind of mobility entails, right, cross-national communications, and this is important, right? So if you're only exposing your learners to certain varieties, namely the so-called standard, then maybe people are missing out, right? So, and this is something that is quite important to remember, right? So this kind of heterogeneity, right? So this kind of diversity exists not only inside the classroom, but also outside, right? So the example that I just gave you had to do with native variations only, right? But when you zoom out, right? So like I said, right from the beginning, when you zoom out a little bit, you can extend that discussion further, right? So because there are a lot of different speakers of second language English, second language Spanish, right? So you have a lot of different varieties that you need to entertain, right? So, and the context situations that we are in, right, have implications for obviously how language evolved through time and how they change, right? And we already saw some examples of word Englishes impacting on the so-called standard English, right? The example that I referred to you guys to earlier about the Oxford English Dictionary is one of them, right? But there are also social consequences as well, right? So this is the social part, right? The social case that I'm going to talk about in just a second. But in terms of acquisition and learning, variations and dialectal variations also has a role to play as well, right? So since I've been talking for quite a bit, right, I want to do a quick experiment, right? So sorry if you've already, so Florencia already told me that she used this before in class, right? So I'm not going to bore you with all these examples, right? But what I'm going to do in just a bit, right, is to try and play different sound clips. Maybe not all four of them, maybe two of them, and I want you to try and sort of do this little experiment with me, right? So as you're listening to it, I want you to think about whether you think this person is intelligent, whether you think this person is friendly, honest, educated, and so on and so forth, right? So as you're listening to these clips, I want you to try and tackle these few questions. And when we're done, I want you to maybe type in the chat what you think. Maybe we'll see differences, but maybe not. Well, let's see. Do we know what we need to do? Yeah, okay, right. So I'll play the first sound clip.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need a small plastic snake and a big toy frog for the kids. She can scoop these things into 3 red bags, and we will go meet her Wednesday at the train station.
Right, so that's the first clip. And then the second one.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring the things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need a small plastic snake and a big toy frog for the kids. She can scoop the things into 3 red bags, and we will go meet her Wednesday at the train station.
Right. What do we think? I can't quite see the chat at the moment because I'm in the sort of presentation, but let me just try and zoom out a little bit and see whether I can see your chat. Right. So what do we think? Any preference from the two speakers that you've heard? Yeah, I can see the chat. First one, right? Okay. No, sorry. Right. So comments? Do you think the first person was intelligent? Second one seems a bit better, but second seems better educated. Okay, right? Other comments? This okay, so differences in opinion. First speaker seems to be more competent. Okay, right? Other comments before I move on?
Excuse me, can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, as regards friendly, I don't think they were too friendly. Speaker number 1 and speaker number 2, they are just serious, but they are not friendly at all. So I would place number 2 or 3 just for question number 2 or for question number 3. Well, honest, I wouldn't value that. They were educated, but I would place 5 or 6 or 7. And not very attractive. I would say that is what you want, that we classify all these features for each speaker. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for engaging. Sorry, if this is something that you guys already done before, right? But this actually helped us illustrate some of the points that I wanted to make in just a second. Let me just go back to the sharing of the screen, right? So, yeah.
Please call.
So who are they, right? So the first speaker actually is from Scotland, so a native English speaker. She is when at the time of recording, she was based in the States, and obviously because she is a native speaker, she had a long period exposure, right? So the second speaker, on the other hand, was actually from Cordoba, Argentina, and he learned English, I think, in school, right? And has lived in the UK for about a year when the recording was taken. So you can see that, hey, there are different opinions that people kind of judge, right? So we don't know who these people were, right? So, but somehow we would form an impression, right? So where does that impression come from is something that is worthwhile exploring a little bit, right? So, and this is what we're going to do in just a second, right? So what we've just done, this was taken from the Speech Accent Archive, right? So this is a very useful information. If you are teaching English, right, so there is a lot more, right? So when I first started out, I heard about the Speech Accent Archive, I think in maybe 2010 or so in one of the conferences. And at that point, there were only a handful, dozens of sound clips, but now there are hundreds and hundreds of clips from different speakers. So if you're interested, you can go and have a look. They all read this standard paragraph, and some of the speech were transcribed so that you can try and explain what those differences are. But just for the sake of that verbal guides technique that we just done, right? So this was what we call a verbal guides technique, right? So people basically are asked to listen to different sound clips, and then they would ask to evaluate their speakers, right? So none of us actually know those speakers, right? But nonetheless, we have some impressions that we have about them, right? So about their education level, about whether or not they're honest or friendly. And this is, for better or worse, right? Something that happens, right? So, and why is that important? Is because, hey, this often have social connotation as well, right? So my colleagues, Robert McKenzie, has done a lot of research. Recently has a big project, funded project in the context of the UK, trying to map out different sort of discrimination, right, or prejudice against different varieties of English in the UK, right? So a more than up-to-date view of what is going on, right? So, but generalizing very, very broadly, we know that speakers who speak the so-called standard varieties are often judged to be more educated, right? So the first speaker, even though her variety was Scottish English, right, still is kind of a native standard, right? And some of the opinions that we saw in the chat reflected that, right? But not everybody agrees, right? So we also saw that, hey, some people didn't feel that the first person was too educated, right? But then also very likely, right, again, generalizing very, very broadly, people with a non-standard varieties like a local native, but not the standard variety, tend to be judged more favorably according to social desirability traits, right? So whether you feel that this person is attractive or friendly, and this happens because of how people are socialized, right? And there are often real life consequences, which I'll explain in just a second in a bit more detail, right? So strategically, even in the sort of world, right, very different from ours in language learning and teaching, or applied linguistics in general, there are so real life consequences, right? Such that many of the call centers are located in strategically located in certain areas just to sort of try and feel a market needs, right? So imagine when you need to call somebody, right? It's very likely that you want to make a complaint, right? So, and when somebody opened their mouth and they sounded a bit friendlier to you, and that kind of alleviate the anger that you might have, right? So, and this is no surprise as to why some of those call centers are actually located in areas where people's speech has been judged or found to be so-called friendly, right? So, but how does that come about is very arbitrary, right? But this is definitely not problem-free, right? So we know that such a thing exists, right? But these type of attitudinal judgments is something that we need to be more conscious about, I think, right? And this is the reason why we are sort of putting a lot stronger emphasis in sort of analyzing and studying these areas, right? So because it can often lead to discriminations and stereotyping. And for example, in real life consequences, right? So whether or not a person sounded like they're from a particular ethnic group. So this was a study done in the States, right? There have been replication studies elsewhere as well. But whether or not you sounded like you're Black in the context of the United States would affect how the jury would judge your evidence, right? So whether or not you are favored as a crime suspect, or whether your kind of testimony in court or as an evidence would be trustworthy or not, would depend on your accent, right? Would depend on what people believe you are, or the ethnicity or the ethnic group that people believe you're in, right? And also, this is highly discriminatory also in another context, right? In the rental kind of market, when people sounded like they are from a Latino kind of background or heritage, in the context of the States, this has also been replicated in the United Kingdom as well, right? So if you sound like you're from certain areas of the US or the UK, the likelihood of you being able to secure a house viewing appointment. So say if you want to rent a property, or if you want to buy a property, whether you sounded like you're from middle class, or whether you sounded like you're from the South in the UK, or whether you sounded like you're white Americans, would affect the chances or likelihood of you securing those apartments, right? So in the context of the UK, right? So if you sounded like you're from the North, chances are people would ask you for the proof of income, right? If you need to actually try and secure an appointment for a multi-million pounds or multi-million kind of dollars house viewing. Whereas if you sounded like you're from the South in the context of the UK, virtually nobody would ask you that. And you can see immediately why this is actually highly problematic, right? Because nobody knows who those people are, right? So we don't know whether they're rich or not. We don't know whether they're educated or not. But somehow that has real life consequences, right? So in the court, there are consequences. In real life applications, right? As mundane as trying to secure a house appointment, right? So that's why we need to try and actively challenge these issues, right? So and there are also political consequences as well, right? So some studies done in done in Canada, in the context of Canada, whether or not you sounded like you're from a specific group would affect how your voters view you, right? So they would want, in the context of Quebec, which is a bilingual place, in Canada is bilingual English-French, whether or not you sounded like you speak with an accent, right, would affect how people would trust you as a political leader, right? We've done, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, and I done sort of similar stuff in the context of UK, in the context of Hong Kong, whether you sounded, how you affiliate yourself to certain ethnic group affiliation would affect your beliefs, right? Would affect whether or not you want to sound in certain way. And this is, again, right, so not problem-free, as we already mentioned. So in an education setting, that can also be highly problematic, right? So we know that the classic studies by Rubin, right? So there are replication studies in late 2000s, which actually demonstrate very similar results, right? So if you look like, right, so this was an extreme verbal guise technique, I suppose, right? So what he did was to try and superimpose an image, right? So what happened was, we know that there were a lot of sort of discrimination against people who are non-white, right, in the context of higher educations. So teaching assistants who are non-white often get complained, right, about their lack of intelligibility, right? So students would complain, right? So what this particular study did, right, and also follow-up replication studies did, was to demonstrate that, hey, actually, it is nothing to do with the actual speech, right? So the same speech was played, but with a different image projected on the screen, right? So whether or not people would judge the speech to be intelligible or not, it's actually dependent on the image that they saw, even though the sound clip remained exactly the same, right? So this is quite damning, isn't it? This tells you that, hey, there's nothing to do with linguistics, it's nothing to do with actual intelligibility, it has everything to do with race and ethnicity, right? So when the Asian teaching assistant face was projected on the screen, people are more likely to actually judge them to be accented and harder to understand, right? Even though fundamentally the speech remained the same, right? So that has its variations, right? Therefore, it has a social nastier side to it, right? So, and it's worth exploring whether this is genetic or not, right? So, but I would argue it is not genetic because I've done some small scale studies that demonstrate that, right? So this has not been published yet, unfortunately, still under revision. I need to really find the time to do this, but I was able to show that children at about the age of kindergarten stage, right? So preschool, I suppose, at about 4.5 years old to about 6, their attitudinal kind of perspectives is very different from slightly older teenagers, right? So at 12 to 14, arguably still children, but the 12 to 14 years old, right, would tend to judge the so-called non-standard accents more harshly than the younger groups of children who are in the kindergarten studies, right? So this was done in a very similar setting, like the verbal guides technique that we just did. And we were able to show that younger children didn't actually have negative attitudes, right? They were very positive towards all varieties, right? Maybe just because they are super innocent, they're quite happy, right? But then the attitude that somewhere between 4.5 years old and 12, there is a shift towards different varieties, basically inheriting those societal views, right? So where those students become more negative towards the so-called non-standard, right? So therefore, the 12 to 14 years old judged the Hong Kong English varieties and Filipino English varieties. I looked at 4 different varieties in that particular study, but they were judging those non-standard varieties much more harshly. And this reflected the society at large, right? So we know that children actually are socialized into this, right? So nobody was born having certain prejudice against other people, right? But they somehow learned it, right? So whether learning is more conscious, right? I would say it's socialized, right? Because they're surrounded by discourses, ideologies that permeate, right? So that permeate and that kind of get transpired and they somehow inherited it, right, without consciously thinking about it and knowing it, right? So we as teachers, I feel, right, quite strongly about this actually, right? In order for us to create a more harmonious environment, a more accepting environment for all people, right? So speak different varieties, speak with different accents, we need to start early. We need to try and intervene, right? So maybe consciously talk about this a bit more, right? And this is the reason why I think there is a need for us to think about trying to bridge to the next bit about linguistics, the linguistic case, right? So the social case, right? I've been trying for the past 20 minutes or so, establish and lay out why it is problematic. So first of all, we know the so-called standard is problematic, right? So it's super arbitrary. And then second of all, those arbitrariness actually led to potential discriminations, right? Social stigma, and those are very real, right? And so what can we do, right? Then when we think about it, if we're depriving our learners from, when we look at the materials, like I said at the beginning of my talk, teaching materials often only include certain varieties, right? So increasingly, maybe after mid-2000s, right? So starting from maybe 2010 onwards, there are more and more incorporation of the so-called non-standard, and also the people who speak non-standard varieties are no longer those people who are engaging in social faux pas or kind of playing a kind of dumb touristy kind of role in the textbook materials, right? But if we're depriving still continuously to deprive our learners from exposure to other varieties, it can create real issues, right? So in the context of Singapore, for example, right? So this is what I've got on the slide. Arguably is a bilingual place, right? So multilingual place really. English is one of the official languages, right? So you have native Singaporean English speakers who only speak English at home, but they still have issues communicating or actually understanding other types of Englishes that they were not exposed to, right? So, and Austrian English, which is spreading across the UK very, very rapidly, it originated from the South, right? So kind of like a working class accent, right? Which is spreading like wildfire, right? So because of spreading like wildfire is not the best metaphor for it because it's very negative, but it's spreading very quickly, right? So spreading very quickly because of media portrayal, and it's also common, it's quite hip for some people. There are certain features such as the TH fronting. So instead of saying three, people would say free, right? So substituting it with a F, and a lot of glottal stopping as well, right? So, and there are also fronting with certain back vowels as well, right? So these are features that are quite common in this particular variety. And arguably native speakers, Singapore, right? So if we want to say that they're native English speakers, would still also have issues with it, right? So what do you expect, right? If they're not exposed to it, why would you not expect them to have problems, right? Because simply they haven't been exposed to this, right? And in many cases, right, because this so foreign and so alien to these learners or these speakers of Singaporean English, the conversation context didn't really help either, right? So we know, therefore, there is a need, right, in terms of pedagogy, right? Maybe this is me trying to bridge towards that linguistic case, right? So if we're depriving our learners from exposure to varieties by limiting them to only those textbook materials, the standards of British English or standard American English, then maybe we're depriving the learners of a real kind of asset, right? Because when they're communicating in a global setting, right, with so many different other speakers, this applies to other languages as well, right? So this applies to second language English, second language Spanish, for example, right? So Andrea's been doing a lot of work, right? So one of your colleagues in here, right? So her PhD is about this, right? So you know that, hey, when you're not giving learners those exposure, then sometimes it's very difficult to change their attitudes, right? To change how they feel about the language, right? So if you need to talk about a problem, you need to first identify the problem, right? So you need to first, if you want to tackle a problem, you need to first talk about it and identify it, right? So if it remains like under the carpet, nobody talked about variations and why it is important or the social stigmatization that can go around it, then nobody would be able to learn, right? So, and also extending the argument to the linguistics aspects, if you're not exposing the learners to those varieties, then they might actually, they could very well struggle, right? When they're trying to communicate with other people. Right, so assessment is also a problem, right? So I have to skip because I'm aware of time. I'll skip through some of the slides. But if we are only exposing our learners to so-called standard, then if they're in a foreign language context where their exposure outside classrooms are it's very unlikely to involve the so-called standard, then maybe there is a mismatch, right? So how do we assess the learners, right, if we're only assessing them by the standard, right? But there are also social, you can see how many of these factors intertwine, right? So, and intersect with one another, because the social things is never very far away from a pedagogical perspective as well, right? So it can also lead to a lot of issues in terms of employment, right? So unchallenged favoritism, right, towards the so-called native, right? So, and we already established from Rubin's experiment, it's not really about whether you're a native or not, but about your face, right? About whether or not you are, at least in the context of English, right, whether or not you look white, right? So, and these can create a lot of issues for teachers, right, in terms of how they see themselves developing as a professional and their identity struggle, right? So, but I don't have time to talk about all these details because I do want to make that linguistic case as well, right? So the linguistic case then, right? So if we work with the assumption that we're trying to prepare our learners for a communication setting where they are very likely to encounter a very diverse range of speakers. They could be native speakers of the language, right? They could be foreign language speakers or second language speakers. So maybe we need to actually make sure that, hey, we're exposing them adequately, right? At least if we know where they are likely to work, right? So if they are likely to encounter certain types of varieties, right? When they need to interact in the business world, for example, then you hopefully want to at least try and expose them to that particular variety, not just so-called standard, right? Which is highly problematic, as I've been establishing. So there is actually an increasing line of research, mainly based on lab-based experiment, right? So laboratory-based experiment, where learners are actually exposed to high variability training, right? So, and Thompson went as far as claiming that this is a proven technique that every language teacher and learners should know, right? Ought to know, right? So why is that the case, right? So what happens in this high variability training, right? So very often, learners would be trained in a lab setting, right? So they will be exposed to different kind of variations, right? Often targeting very specific segmental phonology or segmental kind of elements of the speech, right? So, and for example, a lot have been done in relation to Japanese learners of L2 English, right, or foreign language English in distinguishing R and L sounds, right? Because this is not a contrast that exists in Japanese, right? So they are both considered poor instantiations or examples of the rhotic that Japanese actually does have, which is kind of like a tap, like a flap, rather than an R and L in the English sense, right? So learners in this particular paradigm would receive variations in terms of the talkers, right? So who actually provide the speech samples. That could be also variations in terms of the gender, right? So they're exposed to males and females, right? People with different kind of speech spectrums, right? So the fundamental frequencies, right, can vary, right? So because you know that in the real world, they need to not only talk with one person, right? So from one gender or one variety, but many different varieties of different genders, right? So, and there seems to be evidence to suggest that people who were exposed to these kind of variations during training, they are able to establish a more robust phonological categories, right? So they are therefore able to better retain those distinctions, which seem to be problematic without training, but they are also able to generalize to an extent, right? To new variants, right? To new things that they haven't heard during training, right? So, but of course, this is still quite a recent kind of trends, right? So, and many of the studies have been based in a lab, right? So there is a recent example by Saito et al. Literally just came out in 2022 in language learning, where they introduced incidental learning through gaming, right? So mini games, right? They call it gaming. It's a fancy word of saying a simple kind of game task, right? I like Saito a lot, right? So I know him in person, so I'm not trying to trash him, but it's kind of incidental learning through an app of sort, right? So there is increasing evidence, right? So we know that it could actually work outside the lab setting as well. But when exactly should we introduce those variations, right? And who will benefit the most, right? So whether we should introduce it to lower level learners or whether that could be too overwhelming, right? So if we're introducing too much at the same time, it could be very overwhelming for learners, right? So evidence seems to point to the fact that the maximal benefit by a group of people who've already reached a certain threshold, then they can actually go beyond what they've learned, right? Because they've already built a solid foundation, right? So, but there are still conflicting evidence, right? So more empirical research is needed in this area, right? But what we do know, right? So there is some linguistic evidence, therefore, to support the introduction of variations inside the classroom as well, right? So, and so from the flip side, right? So the earlier study that I did also looked into it, but from a very different kind of perspective because it's not lab-based, right? So age is potentially relevant. There's a chat from Carissa, actually. This is also important, right? So, and therefore, I mentioned earlier that you do need to try and enhance that empirical base, right? So we do have some studies, but we need to do more that are grounded in ecological sense, right? So extending from lab, right? So going outside the lab, right? So Saito et al. Study is kind of an effort of doing that, right? So in my study, actually, we didn't specifically look at or train people to listen to different varieties, but it happens to be the case that they were naturally exposed to different varieties because I looked at a very specific groups of people who were exposed to Filipino accented English alongside, again, in the context of Hong Kong, because Filipino helpers, domestic helpers are quite common, right? So for many middle class people, they employ kind of like a sort of live-in nanny, if you will, who are from the Philippines, and their particular varieties are often different from the ambience variety, which is Hong Kong English, and also the so-called textbook ones, right, which is British, received pronunciation mostly obviously, and also the general American variety, right? So, and we saw actually people who were exposed to naturalistically to different varieties, including Filipino accented English, they are better able to perceive different varieties, right? Which is not a surprise, right? Because in the developmental process, they were exposed to this a bit more, right? So, and some people would say, come on, hang on a second, Alex, right? So if you're trying to introduce all these variations, wouldn't learners grow up having an accent then, right? And this is maybe misguided, right? Because I did also have production data, which proved that, hey, learners are quite aware of, because production partly has to do with their exposure, obviously, right? So they sometimes end up acquiring what they were exposed to, right? But it also interacts and intersects with social factors as well, right? So whether or not a certain variety or certain variant is deemed to be stigmatized, right? Whether it's stigmatized or not, right, would affect what they produce, right? And my production study actually also tell me that, hey, these people don't end up speaking like a Filipino speaker, right? So, and also, of course, right, even if they ended up speaking with a certain accent, we also have to disentangle these notions, right? So because simply because a person speaks with an accent doesn't automatically mean that this person is not comprehensible or intelligible, right? We have got a strong empirical base to support this, right? So we know that these are things that people try and perpetuate, at least in the popular market, because the so-called accent reduction paradigm is a business that generates a lot of money for a lot of people, right? So there is a business interest in there, right? So by telling you that, hey, your English or your second language, whatever, Spanish, right, it works as well, right? So it's accented, right? So you need to correct it. You need to try and reduce it. They're able to make a lot of money out of you, right? So regardless of whether you're intelligible or not, right? And we know, like I said, right, so there is a strong empirical evidence to support, right, that, hey, these notions, although they are closely related, but they are not identical things, right? So what I've been trying to do, therefore, right, is to try and set up, right? So what I started out with, right, is to try and problematize the notion of standard, right? So hopefully you're convinced that, at least in the context of English, that what we've got at the moment in present day English, which is regarded as the standard, is actually very arbitrary, right? So it has a very arbitrary origin, right? But then those social consequences are real, right? So what we need to do, therefore, is to try and problematize this, right? So thinking about a language in a very monolithic, kind of unified way is perhaps not the best way forward, right? And therefore, we can see that, hey, a lot of work in the applied linguistics field is going towards these discussions about decentering, decolonization. And I think there's a positive development, right? Because for us to be able to fight these kind of discriminations, we have to first identify the problem, right? So the problem is that, hey, there's the so-called standard, the purported standard is actually very arbitrary, right? So why do we all kind of want to sing to the same hymn sheet then, right? So there's no linguistic reasons behind that, right? And so that allows us to try and move a bit forward, right? And that those attitudes can change, right? And in the context of the UK, for example, 20 years ago, when I first got to the UK about 15 years or so ago, it was not very common to have regional varieties being represented in public broadcasting, right? But that's no longer the case, right? You can hear a lot of Northern English speakers, right? Speakers from different native speaking varieties and also non-native speakers as well, right? Being represented and not just simply playing the role of a fool, right? So sometimes when you represent in the past, right? Maybe 20 years or so ago, right? So those accented speakers often play a clown kind of role, right? Whenever they are represented, right? But that doesn't seem to be the case, right? So there is a positive silver lining, I suppose, right? So if we're able to identify it, we're able to try and maybe make an effort to sort that out, right? And even if you don't want to subscribe to that view, right, which is backed by social evidence, I hope that the linguistic evidence is strong enough, right? Because we know that, hey, like I said, right? So there's a sort of pinch of salt, right? So you need to sort of take this with a pinch of salt because we still need more empirical research to try and find conclusive evidence in this, right? But there is some evidence to suggest that, hey, introducing variations, at least for people who are at a more advanced level, it might interact with age also, right? And also their setting, right? Whether or not they're in a second language setting or whether they're in a foreign language setting where the majority where the sort of majority language outside classroom is not what they're learning about inside the classroom, there might be a difference, right? So, but if we agree with the premise that everybody who's learning a second or foreign language these days would be communicating with not just native speakers of that language, but also other regional speakers, but also non-native speakers as well, then there is perhaps no harm, right, in trying to expose them to, so that they can get more familiar with those varieties, right? If we say, hey, maybe it's too strong a claim to say that, hey, they can definitely become better, right? So their phonological categories would definitely be more malleable, right? So would be more accepting and accommodating, right? So we don't know that for sure outside a lab-based setting yet, right? But this is where I think potentially interesting research can come out, right? Because if people are going to a real life setting in a classroom and see how the introduction of variations might have an impact on learners and their development, then I think we will be able to make better advice, right? Try and revise our textbooks that we provide for our learners, right? And this, like I said from the beginning, although I've been referring to examples that are mainly based on English, right? I'm guessing that it can also be applicable to many other contexts as well. But I'm also aware, right? So what I'm saying here is very idealistic, right? Because in a context where prescriptivism is very entrenched, when you have national governing bodies, right? So I learned this from Andrea about Spanish, right? If you have all these royal societies telling you that, hey, variation is not always good, right? So you need to expose learners to certain variety, right? In Spanish, peninsular variety, right? Or whatnot, right? In English, if you want to expose learners to only the received pronunciation, right? These are like kind of more the political and policy changes that would take a longer term to fix, right? But I think if we are able to establish a stronger empirical base to support these arguments that I've been trying to make throughout this talk today, then policymakers hopefully will listen eventually, right? And then we'll be able to move towards a world that is a bit more accommodating, right? So create a society that's more just, right? So that we don't discriminate people against, we don't discriminate people just simply based on their accent, right? Or how they speak, or the type of variety that they speak, regardless of the language in question. Okay, I think that's kind of the points I wanted to make. Thank you so much for coming and listening. I welcome questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Can we call you Alex?
Yes? Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, it's casual.
Thank you very much, Alex, for such interesting and enlightening presentation. Here at the School of Languages, there are many people interested in the topic, and I'm sure many MA students would love to run projects in the field. So if it's fine with you, we may start with we may open a brief question and answer session. Yes. All right. So feel free, just for the audience, feel free to activate your mics and ask questions. All right. Let's do it that way instead of using the chat box.
Sure. Thank you so much, Florencia. Thank you. Oh, Maria actually made a point while I was speaking. Yeah, so international exams usually include varieties of English form from B2 onwards. That's true, right? So like I said, they are increasing acknowledgement towards kind of a nod, right? So which is a good direction, right? But still, I think there is a lot more to do. But you're right, and there are more examples of that, especially at a slightly more advanced level. B2 is kind of upper intermediate, between upper intermediate and lower advanced. So yeah.
Yeah,
yes,
I was.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, you go ahead, Maria.
Okay. I completely agree with your views, and I think that while you were speaking, I felt that you were addressing teachers, right? Persuading teachers to include varieties, but sometimes we need to persuade the students to acquire a different or to be exposed to different varieties that are not the standard that maybe they want to pick up, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, no, it's difficult because thank you so much for the question and also comments, Maria. But sometimes it's tricky because I think it's inevitable that people, because of the market force, right? In some sense, we know that I haven't had the time to talk about, if I was to focus only on the social aspect, I would have been able to dig deeper into this, right? Very often, because of the view in the society at large, when somebody speaks with the so-called standard, it gives them a lot of cultural capital, right? So, and this is kind of bringing in Bordeaux, right? And that actually allows people to stand out in some sense, right? If we are thinking about learners, if they want to go places, because of all these discriminations and stereotypes that I just mentioned, and they are very aware of that, right? And many of our learners are, right? And of course, they would want to therefore try and imitate as best as possible, right? Something that kind of that allow them to pass like a near native speaker. But that is often tricky to attain, right? And partly because of the linguistic environment, right? So whether or not they're actually in environment, if they're in a second language situation, that might be slightly better because they're at least outside the classroom, they will still get a plenty exposure to the particular target language, right? But if they're actually in a foreign language classrooms, if their effort is diverted solely to imitating the so-called native standard, right? Then it might be misplaced, right? Because they could have developed a more well-rounded ability to communicate in that target language, be it second or foreign language English, be it second or foreign language Spanish, French, whatever, right? So then it might be an issue about how they manage their resources and time, right? So, but it is difficult to convince them. I had a very similar kind of comment and question when I gave a different version of this talk, but also about the issues of problematizing the issue or notion of standard elsewhere before. They were like, hey, Alex, do you know how entrenched it is, right? So why does, like when we're thinking about learners also, right? So sometimes our learners are adults, right? Sometimes they're children, right? So children listen to their parents and parents often want the best, right? For their children. And the so-called the best, right? Would be the native standard, right? So very often the native textbook standard, because it gives them a bit more cultural capital, right? But that, I argue, can be changed, right? But it will take time, right? It will take some time for people to digest that message, right? And then eventually move towards that direction to try and challenge those, right? We cannot just say, hey, because it's been so entrenched, right? So we just need to stick with the status quo and don't challenge it, right? Because if we stop that, then it will never get changed, right? So it will take time, right? But eventually, this is therefore I said at the very last slide, right? It might be very idealistic, right? But I hope at least more and more people are buying into this argument. Then eventually we can convince them, right? Hey, it's not the case that you will only be valued if you speak like or you sound like a native speaker, right? So you will be valued for the content of what you say rather than the accent in which you say this, right? So, and this is something I think that can be quite powerful and empowering, right? So because, like I said, right, so going back, sorry, I'm sort of taking too long to going around the bush a bit, but I think ultimately, right, so if we don't want our learners to constantly feel very frustrated, right, then they can develop a more positive attitudes and take ownership of what they are able to do rather than adopting a deficit model, right? If they're eternally trying to chase that very elusive native target, then it can become very demotivating, right? And ultimately that's not helpful, right? So if they can feel empowered about what they're actually able to do, it might help sustain their motivation and then become more proficient and a more effective communicator in a global setting. That's kind of idealistic, isn't it? But hopefully, the more we say about the more we talk about these things, hopefully the attitudes we'll be able to change the attitudes a bit. But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying is actually true. And I like this idea that Jennifer Jenkins puts forward when she makes a distinction between model and norm. And she says that, well, we can have different models, native speakers models, non-native speakers models, but not norms, because that says either right or wrong. And
exactly, yeah, it becomes a value judgment, right? It becomes judging people against certain things, right? And then it is kind of this vicious circle of the deficit model all over again, right? So the reason why the Common European Framework of Languages, right? So it's been developed is exactly to try and counter that, right? But that hasn't seemed to solve come across too well. Well, actually, not well. Is at least within the academia, right? So I think it's been taken up quite widely, right? But on the ground, right, there is still this sentiment, right, from learners, from parents, still, right? They're not seeing beyond the so-called native. So yeah. No, thank you, Amelie. Sorry, Amuse. Thank you for attending. Thank you.
And I have a question for you, Alex,
Sure.
because here I agree with you. I totally agree with you that variety should be included in our classrooms. But what criterion or criteria would you follow for the selection of varieties to include in our classrooms?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? So because we can be quite lost, right? So sometimes if we're swimming around with so much in there, what do we focus on, right? So instead of, because our ultimate goal is to try and facilitate the learning process and developmental process of the learners, but at the same time, we don't want to overwhelm them, right? So this is a tricky balance, isn't it, right? So when I would think, right, so it's a bit of a combination of needs analysis and also what we feel that our learners are able to do, right? So when we're thinking about maybe second language English context, right? If we have a specific group of learners, say Asian English learners, right? We need to try and understand what they need to use that language for, right? So if we know that, hey, they are very likely to encounter other people, tourists or colleagues who are from other parts of Asia, then maybe we will be able to narrow it down, right? To try and identify a more specific variety, right? So, and this takes work, right? So therefore, I think, like I said, right? So empirical base, we still need to work on that. We need to try and enrich that. So what type of variety should we include, right? When should we introduce them, right? So are the varieties that we're including, why are we including them? Is it because they will help address the real actual learners' needs, right? And this is something that is quite interesting to focus on, right? And Andrea, in the context of and so precluding or so previewing what Andrea's PhD is about, right? She can tell you all about it later on when she's completed, right? But in the context of South to Spanish, for example, in the context of Argentina, you can see that there is sentiment, right? So there are sentiments where people are becoming more accepting towards varieties, right? But when you actually look at the actual practice, right? They don't often include those, right? So there is a mismatch between what people think are right, right? Or what people think are the right things to do and how they actually do it, right? And this takes time, therefore, going back to Maria's point earlier, it will take time, right? But if we're able to be more principled and our learners understand our perspective as to why we're introducing them, it's kind of like a two-way street, right? So if you want, you need to meet your learners halfway, right? What I'm trying to say here, this is also a point that I made in a Q&A earlier about similar topics, right? So I'm not trying to say that we should not expose learners to the native model. This is definitely not what I'm saying, right? But what I'm trying to say is that, hey, in addition to that model, we need to try and see what our learners really need to use the language for, right? If they are very likely to communicate with, in the context of second language Spanish, for example, if they are likely to communicate with other speakers from other Latino regions, right, in Americas, right, in South America, maybe then at least try and expose them to those varieties, right? If they need to communicate with peninsular speakers, then maybe that would be something that they also need to get. Well, they already get exposure to Peninsula because it's the standard, right? So, but that kind of is what I think is necessary, right? Try and understand the needs of our learners a bit better, and then we can try and sort of meet them and try and sort of see how we can cater our instructions towards that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, just a little comment. When we were talking about the international examinations, I think that only because they include, Maria was saying, they include varieties or some audios in the international exams at B2, for instance. But then just including them as an anecdote or as a color note is not enough, right? So there is a big change and a big work there with the publishing companies, international exams, and then problematizing the absence. What does it mean that there's no variety in the books, in the IELTS or in TOEFL, and then how does that contrast with the real world and what's going on in between? So I think that there is much more work and much more discussion to do, not just exposing them to the varieties, but problematizing that with our students and in the material. Yeah.
And thank you, Andrea. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Exactly, right? So yeah, we need to start somewhere, right? So there is some development, which is a positive sign, right? So at least in public exams, right? At least at the B2 level or above, but we do need to try and actively question them, right? So this is a discussion that I think in the context of the UK, I can speak to this a bit more because I'm so more up to speed with research in around the UK. Also a debate, right? So people are thinking, hey, why are we engaging in this, right? So what does that buy us, right? And why is it important? Exactly like Andrea said, because if we don't call it out, we don't problematize it, we're essentially creating a cycle where we perpetuate the non-question standard, right? And this does not reflect the reality, right? So some people would feel disenfranchised, right? I mentioned earlier about identity, right? So even for native speakers, right, who do not speak a native, as the so-called standard variety, we're not even talking about second or foreign language learners. Simply by zooming in on the native context alone, there are a lot of discrimination issues, right? So this was an example that I also mentioned before in the UK during the Olympics, right? A couple of years ago, there was a non-standard variety speaker, a broadcaster, commentator, who got so much trouble. So, well, not trouble, right? But basically trolled, right? By newspapers, by commentators, by opinion pieces, saying that, hey, her English is like that, right? So this is not how you do it. She's a native English speaker, by the way, right? So it's just that her variety is not the Southern, so-called Southern standard, right? So there is a lot of stakes, right? The reason why people feel that they are empowered, they're in a position of power to judge that is exactly because they haven't seen past their own privileges, right? And this has to do with the sort of new trend of linguistic racism, right? Or linguicism, accentism, and those type of studies, right? So it's not a new trend, right? It's not a new trend at all, because people who are very interested in variationists, the variationist social linguist has always been asking these questions, right? But it is for us, right, as applied linguists, also maybe people are interested in language learning and teaching, to try and bridge that as well, right? So talking about the issue is the first step, right? But how do we actively fight against it, right? Maybe by introducing them in a more positive light in materials, right? And then the learners will feel, hey, actually, my variety is represented here, and I'm not the stupid kind of joker in here. I'm not so falling over or whatever, or doing so silly mistakes or engaging in social faux pas, right? So, but I'm actually making a contribution, right, despite my variety, and that's something that I think we are still quite a long way from, right? So, but hopefully, I'm really hopeful that people, at least in this room, right, or people who I talk to, subscribe or agree to the view that I try to present today, and then maybe we can all become advocates to try and change and create a better, more accommodating and more accepting world. Yeah. And sorry, I can see that people are leaving. Sorry, thank you so much for coming, right? So this Friday afternoon for this talk, a bit heavy maybe, but thank you so much.
No, Alex, it was great. Thank you very much for being here today and for your prompt reply when we sent you the invitation to give this talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Florencia. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you, the audience, for being here today and for your enthusiasm, your interest. And well, you know that here we started organizing conferences, lectures of this kind as part of the MA program, and we are planning to continue. So we're going to give you a break because, as I told Alex some minutes ago, the winter holidays are coming soon. But after we return from the winter holidays, we are planning some more, so you'll get the invitations in due time. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for being here today, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much again. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Thank you very much for being here.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Let's keep in touch, Florence. Bye-bye.
Yes, let's. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.